Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to this presentation. My name is Samuel Johnson. I'm a professor at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. And today we're going to be talking about the St. John's Pottery Studio and its contribution to our examination of culture. This year marks the 40th anniversary of the St. John's Pottery Studio. It was founded in 1979 by potter Richard Bresnahan. The studio is located 70 miles northwest of Minneapolis and St. Paul at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. For decades, the Pottery has operated as a private studio on a college campus supported by St. John's Abbey. Its structure now is a little bit different than that, but for a long time, that's how it existed. We have an exhibition across the street at Westminster Presbyterian Church, and there's a reception today immediately following this presentation from 6 to 8 o'clock. So please join us. I served as Richard Bresnahan's apprentice in the mid to late 90s, where I learned to throw. This is a picture of the studio, and this is the kiln. This is when, in the 90s, when I was working with Richard in the studio. I learned to throw, process raw materials like local clay, load and fire his very large wood kiln, and recycle substandard pots. While I was there, I sensed Richard's dedication to working closely with his regional environment, taking inspiration from place and the community that surrounded him. In time, I began to see how this response to a place was also contributing to an understanding of that place for others, providing perspective and adding to a sense of regional culture. And I think others have seen that too. This presentation is aimed at demonstrating how the St. John's Pottery has had an impact culturally from an artistic, monastic, and culinary perspective. To discuss this issue is Matthew Welch, Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the Minneapolis Institute of Art, Brother Paul-Vincent Niebauer, a monk at St. John's Abbey, Raghavan Iyer, award-winning chef and author, and Richard Bresnahan, potter and founder of the St. John's Pottery Studio.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you all for being here. I know this is getting late in the conference, and I appreciate your presence. So, in 1995, I did an exhibition called First Fire about the firing of the Johanna kiln. And in considering this conference, Sam asked me to address a little bit why a museum would be interested in this local potter, what I found interesting about him. And so, I wanted to begin with that, really. In many ways, it was a natural sort of meeting of souls or minds, if you will, in that I first met Richard Bresnahan in 1990, and I was just fresh back from Japan myself. I had gone 4 years earlier on a U.S. Department of Education Fulbright and spent 4 years at Kyoto University. And Richard, about a decade before that, had returned from Japan after studying with Nakazato Takashi in Karatsu, Japan. And so we immediately had a kind of bond just around a shared experience of both having been passionate about Japanese culture and studies and having spent time there. But I'm sorry, seem to be advancing ahead of myself here a little bit. But what I encountered and what really changed my opinion of this potter and what I wanted to do with him was really part of a much larger narrative instead of just that shared experience. I discovered, a person, an artist who was passionate about his craft, who was making do in the root cellar of an abandoned building on the campus of St. John's University and Monastery, I discovered a place of extraordinary beauty in that monastery. You're seeing here an image of the campus, an aerial view of the campus. Founded in the 19th century by Benedictine monks that traveled all the way from Germany and to Pennsylvania and then on to what was known as the Indian Bush at that point to establish this facility. Both of us spent time both learning from, adapting to, and enduring the tyranny of a Japanese educational system. In Richard's case, under the taskmaster of Nakazato Takashi. In my case, as you see here, under the abbot of Tofukuji, the oldest Zen monastery in Kyoto, Japan, Fukushima Keido, to pursue my interest in Zen and Zen practice. In Richard's case, of course, that sort of demanding level of quality that he carried forward to his apprentices, as you just saw with Sam, that you don't move on to the next model until you're able to reproduce the model that you've been given countless times perfectly. And I think this slide sort of demonstrates that very well. He also returned to the United States, having gained knowledge from his 4 years in Japan about all aspects of pottery making, not just forming pots himself and glazing them, but also kiln construction. Here he is constructing Nakazato Takashi's kiln in 1976, and then his own version of that once he returned to St. John's in 1979. Just like the Japanese, he was bent on finding local materials to produce his work from, and was very fortunate, I think, in almost a serendipitous way, but tapping into the local expertise in the area of finding a vein of some 18,000 tons of clay that he somehow convinced the monks to allow him to excavate and store on campus. It'll be there for the next 300 years. And just like the Japanese as well, not really purchasing industrialized materials, but finding ways to adapt and produce materials for glazed stuffs himself, in this case, harvesting flax ash from the burning of flax straw in North Dakota. The thing that really brought him, as I said, to the fore for me was this amazing firing that happened in 1995, and we hosted then an exhibition called First Fire. And this was the maiden voyage of the Johanna kiln, named after his mentor, Johanna Becker, who is also another interesting aspect of this story. He started his career at St. John's, taking art classes and pottery classes under Sister Johanna Becker. So a Benedictine nun who somehow had managed to pursue her interest in Japanese ceramics and do a PhD in karatsuware, traveling to Japan, being the first woman to be admitted to the Idemitsu Institute for the study of ceramic arts. So that in and of itself was an amazing sort of story. And here was her prodigy, then founding a kiln in central Minnesota, creating an amazing facility, the largest climbing kiln in North America, some 87 feet long climbing kiln in 1995. And so it was sort of a no-brainer for me to host this exhibition. There was something else at play, though, in museums. At that time, it was just sort of starting, and now it's sort of roaring along, I'm happy to say, full force. And that is, museum curators and museums come out of a very much a colonialist mindset. In the 19th century, European museums and colonialist countries would collect objects from cultures around the world. They are the objects that are in our collections today. They're often categorized then strictly by country: Sweden, Germany, Japan. But I had in this young potter somebody who was crossing those boundaries. And the reality of the situation is it's always been that way. It's kind of a misnomer for museums to categorize, as they do. The history of humankind exemplifies this. People always move and migrate, and with them they carry technology, style, and iconography. So when I went to propose this exhibition to the director, it was an unusual idea that we would feature an American potter in the Japanese galleries, but for me it felt right, and happily he agreed with that. But he was doing something even more interesting, and that is he didn't return as a carbon copy of Nakazato Takashi. He was adapting what he had learned to a very specific identity, his own identity, but also a Midwestern identity. And so you can barely see on this little karatsu cup from the 16th century, there's a informally brushed bird in flight. And Richard's interpretation of the, flocks that would darken the sky as a boy in North Dakota as he wandered in the marshes. So an adaptation of motif, if you will, or iconography. Or another example of sgraffito ware, scratching a design into the surface of a pot. In this case, however, his inspiration are the plowed fields of Minnesota and North Dakota, together with slip-applied clouds suggestive of the expansive sky of the Midwest. A classic tea bowl, something that's not part of our domestic idiom for tableware, but nevertheless adapting the glaze, in this case, the beautiful golden hues of sunflower seed hull ash glaze that he was being given from the Cargill processing plant. So a kind of industrial waste being recycled and used to good effect. Local wood being used to fire the pots also resulted in a very specific, even fly ash glaze. That's specific to this area, doesn't look like pots necessarily that were produced in Japan. And the clay itself is part of the identity of Bresnahan's pottery and the studio, this very fine-grained, iron-rich clay of the deposit that he discovered at Lake Batab. The other thing from a curatorial point of view that interested me about this artist was that he was constantly experimenting. He came back from Japan with all these crazy ideas and managed to make them his own and make them suggest a regional identity. But he didn't stop there, and so that he was always doing things that he would have to explain to me again and again to really understand. And I had a conversation just recently about the tea bowl that you're seeing on view here. So it's a complicated process of inlaying both porcelaneous and iron slips and granite dust. Who uses granite dust? As well as navy bean straw ash glaze and flax straw ash glaze. And then adopting technology from industry, in this case at the Kohler plant for industrialized bathroom and kitchen facilities, being able to obtain some of these high temperature beams, so he's not fettered by kiln shelves in the kiln, but is able to tumble stack wares so that you get very dramatic and unexpected glaze patterns or fly ash patterns, as you see here, going up on a vessel when they should be going down, logic would dictate. The other thing that impressed me about this artist coming back from Japan was his commitment to apprentices. Sam mentioned that he was one of them, but over the course of the history of the St. John's Kiln, in fact, Richard has had 15 apprentices and countless students that participate in his environmental studies and design classes. More than being limited to the university itself is an amazing following that has learned about the kiln and the openness of the kiln itself in receiving people who are interested in what the studio is producing. And so here we have Sister Johanna Becker lighting the kiln in 2008 for the 10th firing, but she's surrounded by people from across the country, in fact, from around the world. And most recently, through the auspices of the Mary Livingston Griggs and Mary Griggs Burke Foundation, a fellowship supported so that we're reminded that he's never forgetting the influence of Japan on his craft. And so every year, this fellowship will allow a residency of a Japanese potter to come to St. John's. So I want to close and just say that it's difficult. Sam had asked me to think about the impact of the studio and what that means regionally. And I think, as somebody who tracks metrics in their job all the time, impact is something that's very difficult to gauge and to measure. But for me, and the reason I think that I followed the St. John's Pottery in its activities for the last 29 years, is that it's demonstrated time and again that it's a place of constant evolution, experimentation, and creativity. It is both a place of deep learning and far-flung influences and associations. Potters, again, from around the world converge on this magical place to produce works and to fire them in the kiln. It's a welcoming place where potters and lay people alike are gently brought along. And it's a place that asks nothing more of visitors than that they have curiosity about what's going on. In this way, Richard Bresnahan in his studio aligned with my own mission as a public arts institution and the belief that art is many things, but it is not a luxury. Rather, it's a vital necessity in all of our lives, a point well documented by this amazing gathering at Ensika, as well as the ever-increasing number of people that are drawn into the vortex of the St. John's pottery. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Brother Paul-Vincent Niebauer. I'm a monk of St. John's Abbey. I don't think I've ever thrown a pot in my life, but I would like to say I'm a good friend of Richard and his family, and had the pleasure of working with all of his children at St. John's Prep. I'm from the theater side of the street, but I do appreciate things of beauty, and no, art is not a luxury. When Richard said to me, I was looking for a Mother's Day gift for my mother, who's long since passed away now, and Richard said, Brother Paul, you can select anything from this array of pottery. So I picked a small pitcher, and Richard smiled and he said, I might have known you would have picked the most valuable piece there. My mother taught me well. So he said, fine, clearly I couldn't afford it if I would have paid for it. He said, when the time comes, if it could come back to St. John's, that is all I ask. And so it's been back to St. John's for quite some time now. And it was deeply enjoyed. How do I just press this, yeah?
The green button. Yep.
It's going to happen. And we want to get to our video.
What's
I'm going to use
amazing
the
about
word
monastic
DNA
history
a lot.
is the Spirit just keeps breaking out and reviving us. The very motto of Monte Cassino, the monastery that St. Benedict founded, was cut it back and it still grows. And that's our story. When you look back at the history of the church, from the earliest days, there were Christians who felt a particular call to a life of prayer or service. And over the generations, that became more and more recognized and even institutionalized in the church. So we talk about asceticism, and then eventually we start talking about monasticism as people start forming communities and develop rules and practices and traditions. All of these were gathered together in the 6th century by St. Benedict of Nursia, probably writing around 540, who benefited from all of the experience of monks who had gone before him. Monks in Egypt, monks in Italy, monks in Gaul, southern France. And he wrote a rule that was out there with a lot of other rules, but gradually started to rise to the top. And people said this guy is balanced, he's spiritually deep, he's manifesting his own particular wisdom and experience as a pastor and somebody caring for monks. He established a monastery, his rule was copied. And then the big breakthrough was when the Emperor Charlemagne said, I want to reform my monasteries and I need a rule. And people said, what about this one? And we're here today because that became the monastic norm for the whole Holy Roman Empire, including the parts of Germany where our monastic forebears, who came from Europe in the mid-19th century, they had the rule in their hand, they established monasteries, and so our mother house, Metten Abbey in Bavaria in southern Germany, was part of that great expansion of Benedictine foundations. And they had gone through turmoils of Reformation, of Napoleon, of revolutions. Their monasteries had been closed and reopened, and they thought, where can we go that we can both be safe and do good work for the church? And they looked to where German immigrants were going. Central Minnesota was one of those places. After having stopped in Pennsylvania, and they came out here in 1856. So you had German settlers in central Minnesota. They needed priests, they needed sisters, they needed parishes, they needed schools, they needed hospitals, and Benedictine stepped up. Because there were always some monks and nuns who didn't really want to stay locked in a cloister and felt a call to get out there, be of service, witness to community, provide the kind of care, both spiritual and practical, that people needed. And here we are still doing it.
So even though we, as monks of St. John's Abbey, go back about 162 years, coming in 1856, St. Benedict was born in about 540. And of course, the rule is so much of the rule of Benedict, which if I showed it to you, you'd probably be shocked if you've never seen it before. It looks like a little pamphlet. Has a lot of scripture in it. So Scripture, of course, goes back how far? Goes back to our Jewish brothers and sisters. Oh my goodness. So it reaches way, way, way back. I feel that it's really part of our DNA, not just as Benedictines and as women and men, St. John, St. Ben's monasteries, that live the rule as we see it best. But I think coming out into Minnesota before it was even a state was kind of daring. Those people that arrived knew they would never see their home again. Chances are they would never see their loved ones. That daringness, I think, has not left. St. John's, home of Minnesota Public Radio. When one of the monks said, you know what, Minnesota doesn't have a public radio station, I think we should have one. So the monastic chapter said, go. Many sorts of things. Certainly the St. John's Bible, first handwritten illuminated Bible in 500 years. As I don't know what publication said, it's either the most brilliant thing thought up or it's the most dullest idea ever. It's pretty brilliant. Please come and see it if you like. As Benedictines, we do not take a vow of poverty. We do not take a vow of poverty. We live simply. And some would say because we have a vow of stability, we don't move. We may go off to grad school, courts, visit our families, et cetera, may go, as those early Benedictines did, go to start a new monastery in a new world. But as monastics, we live in the big house, what we say, and those buildings that you saw, they're big, and they're made out of clay. BTW. Because we're in the same place, and we've been in the same place, and it's not just us in that place, it's anyone who wants to come and visit and be with us and enjoy the place. We try to make things as lovely as possible and as thoughtful as possible in the sense that we're not going to have to replace it every 20 years. We really think in 100-year increments. Monks come after me. Those are my brothers. Monks have gone before me. Those are my brothers. My favorite place, one of my favorite places, is the cemetery. So it's that cycle. So it is not amazing, it's remarkable, but it's not amazing that Brother Dietrich, who was president of the university back when the idea of moving Joe Hall and establishing the St. John's Pottery, Richard Bresnahan's Pottery, underneath it, when it came to chapter, Tuesday night we all meet together. All the monks that are solemnly professed have a vote, one vote. We vote for our own abbot, too. We're very democratic. It was a shoo-in. The St. John's Bible was a shoo-in. To establish Minnesota Public Radio. Well, of course. How come it took us this long? That's kind of the way we think at St. John's. So in that respect, it is not an amazing thing that Dietrich so wanted Richard to stay on campus and to be part of who we are. And there comes the rub of saying, well, what is the impact? Oh my gosh, when you talk about monastic life, we often use the metaphor of water dripping on a rock. Day after day, week, month, year, decade, nothing's happening. Well, no, something really is happening. Water is making its way through granite or whatever the rock is. And so as the Pottery Studio has grown with us, so have we grown with it. And to separate, I would say, would be impossible. Would really be impossible. I'm also vocation director for the Abbey. I'm the point person for gentlemen coming in to the monastery thinking about beginning monastic life. And if at all possible, I will always take them over to meet Richard, to see the Pottery Studio, and to have him have at it with them. He's one of the best speakers on behalf of monastic life. That's the way he runs his Pottery Studio. Oh my gosh. Hospitality is a huge Benedictine piece to greet and to receive all visitors as Christ. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if you're at Richard Bresnahan's Pottery Studio, you will be invited to join the entire crew around the table to enjoy tea and anything that possibly Mrs. Bresnahan had made, or something that maybe someone else brought in. It's excellent tea. Of course, the pottery is quite lovely. That's hospitality. Gentle, respecting each other. Our first vow, we have 3 vows. You know that it's not poverty. 3 vows. Obedience, which a better translation today would be respect. To listen to the other person thoughtfully, to, particularly if it's something that you don't like, to pay even more attention, because maybe you should be listening to what they're saying. And just as Benedict says, respect of all things, the materials, to treat, as Benedict says in his rule, to treat all tools of the monastery as though they are vessels of the altar. If you visit Richard's Pottery Studio, you will see things, equipment, heavy machinery that's been repurposed. The Johanna Kiln, recycled bricks, all sorts of recycled materials. The wood from the forest, when there's a good storm that comes through, and we have many acres that we're stewards of, we hope we're good stewards, he will take that down wood, the wood that's come down. To cut trees for it? No, it's not necessary. That's part of how he operates. He's very Benedictine. He's very Benedictine. And another motto that we have as Benedictines, we like mottos, and we've been around for a while. Ora et labora. It's Latin for work, actually prayer and work. Sometimes in the monastery we say ora et labora et labora et labora, but it really is just ora et labora. And what's really meant by that is that there is a blurred line, ideally, that your work should be your prayer. And your prayer, the Opus Dei, should be your work as well. When I watch the apprentices at the wheel, it's a spiritual experience. They're working. But I think after throwing the 50th, example, it's got to be spiritual at that point. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to do it, I don't think. This is my 2 cents. Yeah, conversion to monastic way of life. I spoke about stability and obedience and conversion to monastic way of life. That's our third vow. To be a potter at the St. John's Pottery, one's lifestyle is, and I sort of live with one right now because he's a monastic associate as well, is really being a potter. That's what you're doing with Richard. Hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month. It's the only way to become a real potter. As such, it mirrors monastic life. When do you become a monk? When you put the habit on? When you make final vows? One of the old monks was saying, I think I can tell it, you're at the end of this incredible convention. We were meeting, and the young monks were meeting with some of the older monks, and we had spent the day in silence, and so we were enjoying beer and wine and cheese and crackers. And one of the youngsters said that buzzword, celibacy, and all of a sudden everyone kind of stopped, paid attention. And the question was, so Father, when does celibacy become basically manageable? Like, how many more months do I have to endure, right? And the old monk, Father Berthold Riker of happy memory, said, everyone was listening at that point. His beautiful smile crept across his face, and he said, oh, I think about an hour after they bury your body. The apprentices learn from the master, as do the novices in the monastery learn from the senior monks and the abbot. And all learn from each other as well. Benedict says, listen to the youngest, because the Spirit often, not always, but often speaks through the youngest. As I said earlier, it's difficult to separate the pottery studio and its spirituality from the Benedictine monasticism of St. John's Abbey. It is part of who we are. You can't separate it, and I don't know why you'd want to. Deep respect, practical respect for God's creation, building from the ground God has given us, building to last, and building that is hopefully spiritual and pleasing to the eye. Building community, as you mentioned earlier, the crowds when they fire the Johanna kiln, the people that know about the St. John's Pottery and maybe have never been, but know about it, thousands, tens of thousands around the world. And as a theater person, it struck me when I was contemplating this, that in theater, we say good theater should hold a mirror up to society or up to ourselves. In fact, Hamlet tells the players, before that lovely play in front of his uncle and his mom, to hold a mirror up to nature. Then it will make sense. Then it will be worth watching, listening to. To me, really, the Pottery Studio holds a mirror up to monastic life. And I think in the very best sense, monastic life holds a mirror up to the Pottery Studio. Thank you.
I think you all have to see this picture of Richard. I think this is about the time when you and I both had hair. My name is Raghavan Iyer, and my entire life is about food and everything that goes around it. It is a few years ago, this was probably in the mid-'80s, I met Richard very briefly, when I used to own a catering business way back, and Akiko Sako actually had invited me to do an event at the Minneapolis Art Institute. And in this very pristine, beautiful environment, I briefly had a chance to meet Richard. And then, we parted ways, and years later, in the late I think it was 1995 or something like that, we had a meal together, and we were introduced by a mutual friend, Kim Walter, who was the acquisitions editor for the Betty Crocker Kitchens. And I had just signed a contract with them to write a book that sounds like an oxymoron title. It's Betty Crocker's Indian Home Cooking. And I met Richard and Colette, his wife, and his 3 beautiful kids. And Kim had done some Bombay street foods, and so Kim had some of his pieces there. And then I started chatting with Richard, and at the end of the night, I thought, my God, this man has no passion, does he? Extremely articulate, just like his energy just brought you into what he was doing. And to me, what really intrigued me was the pottery pieces themselves. Yesterday, somebody asked me, do you have any pottery pieces in Richard's kiln? I said, yeah, every bit of it is mine. And I think when I look at his work, especially when you come to my home, you'll see my entire kitchen is equipped with his phenomenal work. I promise you that at the end of my talk, you will probably go leaving hungry, which is close to dinner hour. But it's not the food that speaks for itself. It truly is the background against which the food is displayed. I originally come from, I was born and raised in Mumbai, India, and I lived there for 21 years. So I came to this country as an immigrant, and so I came with a culture already in place, but also learning to assimilate another culture, which was my adopted land, the United States. And so when you talk about culture, and when Richard brings into the mix something that he learned and kept intact, what he learned in Japan, and I felt like there was some kind of a connection there in terms of you understand what it takes to come from another culture and try to maintain that, but at the same time try to project your own stamp on something that hugs 2 cultures. And I think he truly embodies that with some of his works. One of the other things that really people always ask me, well, do you always, plan your meals and you plan your food based on Richard's pottery? I said, not at all. To me, the pottery speaks for itself. And to me, the food has to speak for itself. Because when I think about food, I think about 7 taste elements. I think about color. I think about texture. I think about temperature. And that, to me, really shows you the gamut of a well-executed meal, but it's also that satiating factor that you leave behind. And so when I started getting some of Richard's pieces early on, I would always put them in a cupboard and I wouldn't use them. And I was chatting with Richard, and the whole concept of functional pottery was very new. And he said, do you want to be remembered when you die by your plastic and china that you use, or would you like to be remembered somehow else? And that really resonated over the years. And I thought, I'm going to enjoy those pieces on a daily basis. So my morning latte starts with his pieces, and all throughout the day it ends with his signature gin tonic mugs, which he's, of course, I think there's gin in there, by the way. So that sense of feel when you're when you're eating out of his plates and his bowls. And you really see the sort of the ergonomic quality of working and using his pieces, because you carry them in your hands and you eat with your, and coming from a culture where, you give Indian food to me, it's a Pavlovian response. I reach for my fingers. In one of my books I wrote, eating with silverware is like making love through an interpreter. There's something lost in that translation. And so with Richard's pottery, it is about that sense of touch and the sense of feel. It's that well-known scene that you saw in the movie Ghost. That sensuous quality of touching that pottery. But to me, it's the end result of, you look at it. And Margaret actually and her sister Sarah were over for Sunday brunch one time. And so I just made things that I didn't want to spend a lot of time working on. I'm a lazy cook in some ways. And so, but the platters that I used, I think lends itself so beautifully well to showcasing. So you may be the world's lousiest cook, but I think you put it on one of Richard's platters, it truly shines and it comes through really, really well. Which is another thing that really brought me to Richard, was that sense of community. Again, you see eating with hands, but also eating with people that you really love and want to be part of at the table. And so food really became the central part. And I think when you look at his pieces, I have the opportunity at the end of his firing, every 2 years that he fires his kiln, he has me come over for the final firing, which is always on a Sunday, on a fall day, and I do the meal. It's usually for about 100, 150 people, sometimes more, people who have worked on the firing, and then also the folks who are from the community, and we basically get together and we eat. But what always strikes me was, when you look at the food that is naturally presented in some of these bowls, it draws people to the table, and there's a sense of, I still feel like food is a very strong connection that weaves in all these different cultures. And when you look at Richard's pieces, which I always continue to admire on a daily basis, I always say, when I look at his pottery, I lust after them, because they are just so beautiful in its own, and there's you don't even have to serve anything on it. I think you can just look at it and imagine what goes into it. And so from a standpoint of it, of somebody who really gets into food, I don't have to plan my menu based on what it looks like. Naturally, what I make, and I think just grabbing one of Richard's pieces speaks for itself. And one of his other signature pieces, which I've always loved, is what he calls the Sushi Platter. And you see some of those platters that are also the bigger pieces of it, which I do need one of them, by the way, are at the Westminster Church there. But also the juxtaposition of when you're looking at shapes, when you're looking at colors, when you're looking at sizes, especially when it comes to food, you always try to put food that is different looking. So in other words, you don't put anything that is round on a round plate, because it gets lost in it. And I think when you look at, I look at the platters and the stuff that Richard has. Anything that I do, you put the opposite on it. And I think that's what is really amazing about his work, is opposites work. Coming from a country where, you look at everything that looks chaotic, but at the end of the day, it all makes sense. There's a sense of balance that comes through. And I see Richard's sense of balance in his pottery, because I truly do feel that at the end of the day, it is about balance. Nothing should overpower anything else. And so the whole talk about local, sustainable, and I think he embodies that. And you go to his house and, everything is grown that they cultivate, and everything from herbs to vegetables to chickens. I mean, I'm fortunate I get eggs delivered by his beautiful daughter Margaret every 3-4 weeks. And when you look at eggs from chickens, you know, they are absolutely gorgeous to look at. And you just take a simple piece of chicken or an egg and you make a poached omelet with it, and you put it on one of his plates. And it just sings beautifully. So I think, to me, that's what it draws me to Richard's work, is really the beauty of what he does and the lifestyle that he lives, because to me, you have to walk the talk of all of that, and he truly does. And again, you know, I'm fortunate I have a complete dinner set of his that graces my table on a daily basis. And yes, there's gin and tonic in the back. So, and you do see a fair amount of that happening. So, and to me, that really what you really walk away with is that you have to eat with all your senses. And you know, my partner looked at me the other day. He goes, "Can't you just eat something? Why does it have to be a production?" And I said, because it could be your last meal. It could be a last morsel that you put into your mouth. And so to me, the importance of having everything just right. I don't style my food, by the way. This is just, and I'm the world's worst photographer. So if I can just click one shot and it shows you the beauty of everything, it's really the beauty of the pottery that comes really well. Nothing is the same. And I think food, if you execute it really well, every food really should be different each time you make the same thing. And to me, that's really the joy of unearthing that kiln at the end of the firing. When it cools down, nothing is the same there. And you're unearthing this gift that is absolutely beautiful to touch and feel. So I hope you look at his pottery and you look at food in that limelight, because it goes hand in hand. And I cannot imagine a world without functional pottery like that. So anyway, so thank you for the opportunity to talk. So.
Thank you all for coming. I know that we would like to entertain questions fairly quickly, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. And I want to thank Dr. Welch and Matthew, Sam Johnson for organizing this, as well as Brother Paul-Vincent and Raghavan for giving presentations that are more mythology than reality. Because we're going to be very quickly going through these, let's pay the green button, okay. I have one story I'm going to tell, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I'm going really off script on this, and Sam's going to be really upset. So I know this is going to be tough, but you know, how do you get here? And the last 3 days, there've been some wonderful young people coming to the studio and say, "How do you get this?" And then, "How did you get to this point?" And I think that's to encourage young people. This is the first time I'm speaking at NCECA in 40 years. And so I want to thank my Clay family. Be able to speak to you, and I'm really deeply honored that I have this opportunity. And there were a pivotal moment that so many students come, the faculty, you can see that it's like the faculty's going and you're asking, where did my students go? Because they took off, you know, and they're having a wonderful time here. And when you're a student in ceramics, you really look to your teachers as your guide. Chuck Hines is here. Paul McCoy is here. There's these wonderful teachers here who have given their lives to teaching. So, I had an experience. We probably feel like it gets difficult when you're thinking about what you'll do with your life, and then the bell goes off inside you, and you're going to become a potter. And you tell your parents. And the other aspect of it is growing up in North Dakota, the National Guard of North Dakota during World War II walked the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. So there was this deep hatred of the Japanese that I grew up with, which was very difficult. So, and what Warren McKinsey and many people did after World War II to bring Japanese culture to America, they took great risks. They took great risks to do that. So I remember in 1972, my teacher, Bill Smith, he worked with Marguerite Wildenheim, Mills College, first MFA, Mills Pond, Bauhaus architecture. And I grew up around Marcel Breuer and Bauhaus architecture since I was in high school and college. So Bill Smith comes and says to me, and I've told this to my apprentices, and first day of class, he gives this incredible lecture about the diversity of the clay mind. Peter Vokas, all these, Glenn Nelson, all these wonderful men and women that were creating these unbelievable things with clay. And he said, your mind is your limitation. The clay can speak itself. So, and then the next class, he says, okay, now for those people who are going to go in the glaze room, cobalt is $125 a pound right now. So I want you not to make all these blue glazes, because that would, and so we all know about cobalt and blue glazes and stuff like that, and then you get a glaze mate in college. We're on glaze, and I've got this little tiny nun from the Bahamas, Sister Claire Rosini. And she's my glaze mate. So I'm a whiner at that time. Like when college students are a bunch of whiners anyway. We all know that. And so I was whining about the fact that cobalt was $125 a pound. Why do we have to not only use like 1% of it in the glazes? And I was just whining. And finally, this very kind, wonderful human being, nun, slams her spoon down on the counter, just bam, and she looks up at me and she says, if you knew where your materials came from, you wouldn't be such a smart ass. So it's the first time I ever heard a nun swear at me. I probably deserved it. You just got beat the next time. But anyway, she said, when I was a novice nun in the Bahamas, I was sent to Rhodesia. And my service was to care for the poor that were mining your cobalt. And because it's $125 a pound, is because the United Nations just did a total economic embargo on Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, because of the brutality of apartheid and the brutality to those individuals mining my cobalt. That's when the onion starts getting peeled away a little bit, and you realize that I didn't know where anything came from. I didn't know where my materials came from. I didn't know how to build a kiln. I never had dug clay before. It all came in bags. And then I realized that the only way that I was going to be true to myself was to not do this. So then I went down to my art history teacher, Sister Johanna, and I said, I'm in trouble. And I said, I want to be a potter in the worst way, but I don't know how to do anything except throw pots and think great ideas. And she says, well, you're going to have to leave your country. And I said, what do you mean? She says, you have to go to Japan. And I go, oh, no. This is not going to be good to talk to people at home about. So she got me this apprenticeship, and it transforms you, transforms your life, creates new stories that you bring back. And that transformation means that I don't do any work unless there's a story behind the work that I make, that I can articulate it, and I won't make anything unless it has a relationship to my environment in the best possible way. And to teach my apprentices that we need an echo-mutual relationship in life. And that echo-mutual relationship in life is critical for human health and for the earth. So in order to be able to manifest that process, it takes a lot of time to get to know your neighbors, to ask them about straw and materials and clay. It takes a long time to find other visionary artists to collaborate with and to articulate your dreams. You need to have people that believe in your vision and be able to be part of a legacy to pass on to the next generation. So I thank my clay community, Jack Troy, all the people that I have admired for many years, and Chuck and Paul and all these great people who are your heroes. It's good to have heroes, not fake ones like He-Man and Barbie, but real heroes like Daphne Hatcher and Gary. All those people that, you know, we're all kind of heading that way out the door and asking you young people to carry on. Thank you. We have 3 minutes for questions. And there's a mic down here that if you have a question. But thank you all for coming.
How did you find the seam of clay?
There's a mic.
Okay, there's a mic right here. Does it actually work? Yes. Yeah. Does it actually work? It works. Okay. So find the seam of clay. So this is very important, is that the local community, so people, that's one of the big things, because there's something, thing on wild clay. Well, there is no wild clay. Every ecosystem that the people live in is not wild. It's your environment. And you have to listen to what the clay tells you. So when I got back in '79, I met a man by the name of Francis Schillinger. And he was a carpenter who read Buckminster Fuller and the Foxfire series. And he was, with his children, rock hunting, you know, for the 4-H club. And his children found these beautiful crystals growing inside this black material. And he dug a pail of it with, an ice cream pail, and brought it back home. And so I got to meet him, and I said, how did you know that it was clay? And he says, well, Richard, I tasted it. And then I realized I was in the presence of a genius. So Francis Schillinger showed me that, and then we got so excited, we dug some right out of the ditch. He said, oh God, you can't dig in the ditch, it's a township road right away. You know, you're gonna kill somebody. So that kind of folded into the slide that you saw of digging the clay. But the one thing about the monastery is that I went in with my van to the bank to ask for a loan at the bank president, and I had hair at the time, didn't work real well. So the one thing about the bank president, I parked the van right out in front of his window, and I said, Art, I got my checking account with you. I need a $4,500 loan, and I want to hire a heavy moving company to move 18,000 tons of pottery clay over to St. John's, and I want to use my van as collateral. And he says, get the hell out of my bank. Okay, Art. So then the next day I went up to Father Michael Blecker, who was my president when I was in college, and I said, Father Michael, we found this beautiful clay deposit, and all of our clay deposits in Minnesota become Class 5 gravel or Class 2 shouldering gravel. We take beautiful clay deposits of incredible value and mix them into sand and gravel to make road construction material. It's really terrible. We've got a huge disconnect on how we abuse our materials here. So I went to Father Michael and I said, I found this clay deposit in Collegeville Township. They closed the road down because the contractor didn't do his job, and the cars are sliding off in the ditch. You got to dig the clay deposit out. So I went to the township and I said, I'll dig your clay deposit out if you give me the clay. And they said, when can you start? So I went to Father Michael and I said, I need a $4,000 loan, Father Michael, to go dig enough clay for 300 years of pottery making. He turns in his chair and he looks at me and he says, well, in 1,500 years of Benedictine history, that's not all that long, Richard. I trust what you're doing. I'll take it out of my personal budget from the president's office, and we'll dig the clay. Now, there's the short-term view from the bank and the long-term view. So if it wasn't for the monastery, who believes in generational transformation, this wouldn't be possible. So that's how the clay deposit was discovered. And we've reached 5:30 in the evening, and I think we have to leave. So thank you very much.